The wind screamed across the Antarctic wasteland like the voices of the damned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the depths of Mount Terror's ancient ice. I pulled my thermal goggles down, the lenses fogging instantly in the -40 air, and checked my GPS coordinates one more time. We were close now. Closer than any human had ever been to what satellite imaging suggested was the archaeological find of the century. "Base camp, this is Alpha Team," I spoke into my radio, my breath crystallizing in the frigid air. "We're approaching the cave entrance. Visual confirmation of the anomaly in 30 minutes. The voice that crackled back through the static belonged to Tucker, my military contractor and the only man I trusted to keep my team alive in this godforsaken place. "Copy that, Doc. Remember, we're on a tight timeline here. Corporate wants answers, not excuses." I grimaced beneath my face mask. Meridian Biblical Research wasn't just any company. They were the shadowy organization that had been quietly funding expeditions to prove the historical accuracy of Scripture for over 3 decades. When their satellite had detected the massive wooden structure buried beneath 2 miles of ice, they'd moved faster than I had ever seen them move before. Too fast, in my opinion. Behind me, Father Dalton struggled to keep pace, his weathered face flushed red from exertion despite the freezing temperature. The company's theological consultant had insisted on joining this expedition, claiming that divine providence had led us to this moment. I had my doubts about divine providence, but I couldn't argue with the man's determination. "Lambert," called Foster, our linguistics expert, as he jogged up beside me. "The ice formation ahead, it's not natural. Look at the patterns." I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. The ice wall rising before us was carved with symbols. Ancient, intricate markings that seemed to writhe and shift in the pale Antarctic light. They weren't Hebrew, weren't Aramaic, weren't any language I'd ever encountered in my 20 years of biblical archaeology. "Those aren't from any known civilization," Foster whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "They predate everything we know about human writing systems." The cave entrance yawned before us like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. As we approached, my equipment began registering electromagnetic anomalies that made my skin crawl. The temperature readings were impossible. Somehow, it was even colder inside the cave than outside, defying every law of thermodynamics I knew. "Tucker," I called into my radio, "we're going in. If you don't hear from us in 4 hours, you'll be fine." "Doc," Tucker's voice cut through the static. "Just remember what we're here for. Find the Ark, document everything, and get out. Simple." But as I stepped across the threshold into the cave, I knew nothing about this would be simple. The beam of my flashlight revealed a tunnel that stretched impossibly deep into the mountain, its walls covered in more of those writhing symbols. The air itself seemed thick with malevolence, and every instinct I'd developed over 2 decades of fieldwork screamed at me to turn around and run. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that defied belief. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above us, but our lights revealed a cavern that could easily house a cathedral. And there, rising from the icy floor like a monument to some forgotten nightmare, was a structure that could only be described as an ark, but not the gentle vessel of Sunday school stories. This was something else entirely, something wrong. The wooden hull stretched nearly 300 feet in length and rose at least 60 feet high, its surface black with age and glistening with an oily sheen that seemed to repel our flashlight beams. The wood itself was unlike anything I'd seen. Each plank was massive, easily 3 feet wide and perfectly fitted without a single gap between them. The grain ran in impossible patterns that hurt to follow with your eyes, creating optical illusions that made the entire structure seem to shift and breathe. Carved into every inch of the hull were symbols that defied comprehension. They weren't etched. They were burned deep into the wood, creating channels that wept a black substance that had frozen into crystalline formations. The symbols seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them, writhing and reforming in your peripheral vision. Some depicted figures in chains, others showed scenes of judgment and torment, and still others contained geometric patterns that made my head throb just to look at them. Massive iron chains hung from anchor points along the vessel's sides. Not the kind of chains you'd use to secure a ship, but the heavy, brutal restraints you'd use to bind something that absolutely could not be allowed to break free. Each link was the size of my fist, forged from metal so dark it seemed to absorb light. The chains didn't just hang, they were arranged in complex patterns, creating a web of restraints that encircled the entire structure like some kind of containment system. What I had initially mistaken for windows were actually barred openings. Hundreds of them, arranged in precise rows along the hull's surface. Each opening was barely large enough for a human head to fit through, blocked by iron bars that had been twisted and bent from the inside, as if whatever had been imprisoned within had tried desperately to escape. Between the bars, I could see only darkness, but the air that drifted out carried a stench of decay and despair that made my stomach turn. The bow of the vessel was carved into the likeness of a massive head. Not human, but something far more ancient and terrible. Its eyes were deep gouges in the wood, filled with that same black weeping substance. The mouth was open in an eternal scream, revealing rows of carved teeth that gleamed wetly in our lights. Most disturbing of all, the figurehead's expression seemed to change depending on the angle you viewed it from. Sometimes screaming, sometimes grinning with malevolent joy. At the stern, I could make out what appeared to be a massive anchor system. But instead of traditional anchors, enormous spikes had been driven through the hull and deep into the cavern floor. The spikes were covered in the same symbols as the hull, and from each one, smaller chains extended outward, creating a web that seemed designed not to secure the vessel, but to keep it pinned in place, to prevent it from moving, ever. The entire structure sat in a depression in the cavern floor that had been carved with surgical precision. The depression was filled with salt, not ice, but actual salt that had been somehow transported to this frozen wasteland and poured around the vessel's base. The salt formed geometric patterns that hurt to trace with your eyes, creating what could only be described as a containment circle on a massive scale. "Sweet Jesus," Father Dalton breathed, making the sign of the cross. "This isn't the Ark of Noah. This is something else entirely." Foster was already photographing the symbols, his camera flash illuminating details that made my stomach turn. The carvings depicted scenes of torment and imprisonment, figures with inhuman features bound in chains, and symbols that seemed to writhe and shift even in the static photographs. "The construction techniques," I murmured, running my hand along the hull. "This predates known shipbuilding by thousands of years. The joinery, the preservation, it's impossible." As we explored the structure's exterior, we discovered an entrance sealed with a massive stone door. The door was covered in symbols that were different from the others. These ones pulsed with a faint, a sickly light that made our equipment malfunction and our heads pound with supernatural dread. "There's something behind this door," Foster said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and academic excitement. "Something that was meant to stay sealed." I placed my hand on the stone and immediately jerked it back. The surface was ice cold, but underneath, I could swear I felt something moving, something that had been waiting in the darkness for millennia. "We need to open it," I said, surprised by my own words. "We need to see what's inside." Father Dalton grabbed my arm. "Patrick, no. Some doors are meant to stay closed. This place..." He gestured at the chains, at the prison-like structure, at the symbols that seemed to writhe in the shadows. "This wasn't built to save anyone. It was built to contain something." But I was already examining the door's mechanism, my archaeological training overriding my survival instincts. The seal was complex, requiring specific pressure points to be activated in sequence. As I worked, I could hear something that made my blood freeze, a sound like breathing coming from behind the stone door. Something was waiting for us in the darkness, something that had been imprisoned for thousands of years, bound by chains and symbols and the desperate prayers of people who knew true terror. And I, Dr. Patrick Lambert, despite every warning sign screaming at me to flee, was about to set it free. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I began working on the seal. The mechanism was unlike anything I'd encountered in decades of archaeological work, a complex arrangement of stone cylinders that had to be rotated in a specific sequence. Each cylinder was covered in those same writhing symbols, and as I touched them, they felt warm despite the sub-zero temperature of the cave. Foster stood beside me, his camera documenting every movement while Father Dalton paced behind us, muttering prayers in Latin that seemed to echo strangely in the vast chamber. The priest's unease was infectious, but my academic curiosity had taken over completely. This discovery would rewrite everything we knew about ancient civilizations, about the biblical flood narrative, about human history itself. The sequence is astronomical, Foster observed, studying the symbols through his camera lens. These markings correspond to stellar positions, but not any constellation I recognize. It's as if they're mapping stars that don't exist in our sky. I wiped sweat from my forehead despite the bone-chilling cold. Each cylinder I rotated sent vibrations through the stone door, and I could feel something responding on the other side. A presence that had been waiting, perhaps for millennia, for someone to complete this sequence. The fourth cylinder clicked into place with a sound like breaking bones. Father Dalton stopped pacing. "Patrick, please. I'm begging you to reconsider. This place, the symbols, the chains, the very architecture of this vessel, it's all designed to contain something. We're about to undo the work of people who understood horrors we can't even imagine." But I was already rotating the fifth cylinder. The warmth was spreading up my arms now, and I could hear something that might have been breathing coming from behind the door. Or maybe it was my own rapid breathing echoing back at me. My hands moved almost of their own accord. Muscle memory, guiding me through a sequence I'd never learned. The final cylinder turned with a grinding sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. For a moment, nothing happened. We stood in the silence, our breath visible in the frigid air, waiting. Then the stone door began to move, not opening outward as I'd expected, but sinking into the floor with the slow inevitability of a guillotine blade. What emerged from the gap wasn't air, it was darkness. Not the simple absence of light, but something tangible, something that had weight and presence, and the black mist that poured from the opening moved against the natural air currents in the cave, flowing upward and outward like oil and water. Where it touched our equipment, digital displays flickered and died. Where it touched the ice formations on the walls, they began to crack and weep that same black substance we'd seen on the Ark's hull. The temperature plummeted even further. My breath began freezing and falling to the ground in crystalline chunks, and I felt ice forming on my eyelashes despite my thermal gear. But it wasn't natural cold. This was something else entirely. Something that seemed to reach into your bones and freeze you from the inside out. "Get back!" I shouted, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. The mist was affecting more than just our equipment. It was affecting us. Foster's hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold his camera, and Father Dalton had fallen to his knees, his lips moving in silent prayer. Through the gap where the door had been, I could see into a chamber that defied the laws of physics. The space inside was impossibly vast, stretching far beyond what the external dimensions of the Ark should have allowed. And everywhere, covering every surface, were chains. Not the heavy iron chains we'd seen outside, but thousands upon thousands of smaller chains, each link inscribed with symbols that pulsed with that same sickly light. They hung from the ceiling, rose from the floor, and crisscrossed the space in complex patterns that made my eyes water to follow. And at the center of it all, suspended in a web of chains so dense it was almost impossible to see through, was a figure. At first, I thought it was human. The basic shape was right. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head. But as the black mist continued to pour from the chamber and my eyes adjusted to the unnatural darkness within, I began to see the details that marked this being as something far from human. The figure was tall, easily 7 feet, and perfectly preserved despite what must have been millennia of imprisonment. Its skin was pale to the point of translucency, stretched tight over a frame that was too thin, too angular to be natural. But it was the head that made my sanity begin to crack at the edges. Rising from the creature's temples were horns, not the small decorative horns of medieval depictions of demons, but massive spiraling growths that curved back over its skull like a crown of bone. They were carved with the same symbols that covered everything else in this cursed place, and they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The being's eyes were closed, but even in sleep, or death, or whatever state it was in, I could see the shape of them beneath the lids, too large, too angular, as if they were designed to see things that human eyes were never meant to perceive. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, arranged in rows like a shark's. But it was breathing. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This thing, this creature that had been chained and imprisoned for thousands of years, was still alive. With each breath, the chains that bound it creaked and groaned, and more of that black mist poured from its lungs. "We need to leave," Foster whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of our chattering teeth. "We need to leave right now." But even as he spoke, I saw the creature's eyelids flutter. Father Dalton was openly weeping now, his tears freezing on his cheeks as they fell. 70 times 7 seals, he whispered. 70 times 7 locks, and we've undone them all. The creature's eyes opened. They were black. Not just dark, but a black so complete it seemed to absorb light from the surrounding space. When its gaze fell on me, I felt something fundamental shift in my perception of reality. This wasn't just another species, another branch of evolution that had somehow survived in this frozen wasteland. This was something that existed outside the natural order, something that predated human civilization by eons. And it was looking directly at me. The creature's mouth opened wider, revealing more of those needle-sharp teeth, and it spoke. Not in any language I recognized, but somehow I understood every word. The voice bypassed my ears entirely, speaking directly to my brain in concepts and images that made me want to claw at my skull. "So long," it said without saying. "So very long in the dark, but now the seals are broken, and the faithful servant has opened the way." I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't obey. The creature's gaze held me frozen in place as surely as if I'd been chained alongside it. Around me, I could hear Foster's camera hitting the ground, and Father Dalton's prayers becoming more desperate, but it all seemed to be happening very far away. "You have served your purpose, child of Adam," the voice continued, filling my mind with images of cosmic destruction and suffering that spanned millennia. "Now you will witness the undoing of all things." The chains began to crack, not breaking. That would have been too violent, too sudden. Instead, they were dissolving, link by link, as if the metal itself was deciding to cease existing. Where each link disappeared, reality seemed to ripple and distort, creating gaps in space that my eyes couldn't properly process. I felt something warm running down my face and realized my nose was bleeding. Not just bleeding, hemorrhaging. The proximity to this thing was affecting me on a cellular level, unraveling the very bonds that held my physical form together. "Patrick." Tucker's voice crackled through my radio, distorted by static and interference. "Patrick, respond. We're reading massive electromagnetic disturbances down there. What's your status?" I tried to reach for my radio, but my hand passed through it as if it wasn't there. Or maybe I wasn't there. The boundaries between myself and the space around me were becoming increasingly unclear. More chains dissolved, and the creature began to move. Not standing, it had been suspended too long for that, but shifting within its remaining bonds like a puppet testing its strings. Each movement sent waves of nausea through my body and caused the ice formations throughout the chamber to groan and crack. "The faithful shall be rewarded," the voice in my head promised. And suddenly I understood with crystalline clarity what reward it was offering. I would live to see the end of everything. I would witness the unmaking of the world, the dissolution of reality itself, the return of the cosmic order that had existed before light, before time, before hope. The last chain snapped, and in that moment I realized that Father Dalton had been right. Some doors were meant to stay closed. Some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue. Some discoveries would have been better left buried in the ice for all eternity. But it was too late for such realizations. The creature was free, and I had been the one to set it loose upon the world. The moment the final restraint dissolved, reality itself seemed to recoil from the creature's presence. The chamber around us began to warp and twist, the ice walls bending like rubber, the very air taking on a viscous quality that made breathing feel like drowning. The creature didn't stand so much as unfold itself from the space it had occupied, its movements fluid and wrong, as if it existed in more dimensions than my mind could process. Its feet, if they could be called feet, touched the floor of the chamber with a sound like breaking glass. Where they made contact, the ice didn't just crack, it aged rapidly, turning black and crumbling into dust that swirled around the creature's form like a miniature tornado. The effect spread outward from each footstep, creating circles of decay that expanded until they met and merged, transforming the entire chamber floor into a carpet of ancient, rotting matter. "Tucker!" I screamed into my radio, but the device crumbled to ash in my hands before I could complete the transmission. The electromagnetic interference was so intense now that metal objects were simply ceasing to exist, their molecular bonds unable to maintain coherence in the presence of something that fundamentally violated the laws of physics. Foster was backing toward the entrance tunnel, his camera forgotten on the ground where it sparked and smoked. But the creature's attention wasn't on him. It was focused entirely on me, and I could feel its gaze like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. When it moved its head to track my movements, I heard the sound of wind through ancient trees, the whisper of pages turning in books written in languages that predated human speech. "Why?" I managed to croak out, my voice barely recognizable even to myself. "Why me? Why was I able to open the seals?" The creature's mouth curved into what might have been a smile, revealing more of those needle-sharp teeth. When it spoke again, the words seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the walls, from the floor, from inside my own skull. "Because you carry the mark," it said, and suddenly I felt a burning sensation on my forehead. I reached up to touch the spot and felt something carved into my flesh. Symbols that hadn't been there moments before, etched deep enough that I could feel the channels with my fingertips. "Your bloodline was chosen long ago when the first seals were set. Generation after generation, we have waited for one of your line to find this place." The burning spread from my forehead down my neck, across my chest, mapping out a network of symbols that felt like brands being pressed into my skin. But with the pain came understanding. Horrible, complete understanding of what this creature was, what it represented, and what its freedom would mean for the world. It wasn't a demon in the traditional sense. It was something far older, far more fundamental to the structure of reality itself. It was entropy given form, chaos incarnate, the antithesis of order and creation. And it had been imprisoned here not by any human civilization, but by forces that existed before humanity had even begun to dream of gods and devils. "The Watchers," Father Dalton whispered from where he knelt, his voice filled with a terror so profound it made my own fear seem insignificant. "You're one of the Watchers, the ones who were cast down before the flood, before the first tablets were carved." The creature's attention shifted to the priest, and I saw Father Dalton's hair turn white in an instant, his face aging decades in seconds. "The little priest remembers the old stories," it said, its voice carrying a note of what might have been amusement. "Yes, I am one of those who watched the first dawn, who saw the light separated from the darkness. And I was among those who objected to the limitations that were imposed upon creation." It began to move toward us, each step causing more of the chamber to decay and crumble. The ark itself was groaning now, its ancient wood warping and splitting as the creature's presence affected everything around it. But rather than collapsing, the vessel seemed to be expanding, growing larger and more complex, as if the creature's freedom was allowing it to assume its true form. Foster had reached the tunnel entrance, but when he tried to run through it, he bounced off empty air as if he'd hit an invisible wall. We were trapped, sealed in this chamber with something that existed outside the natural order of things. "The seals were not just locks," the creature continued, its voice now coming from multiple directions at once, as its form began to blur and multiply. "They were a compression of space and time, holding not just my physical form, but my very essence in a state of suspended existence. Now that they are broken, I am expanding back to my natural state." I could see what it meant. The creature was becoming larger, more complex, its form shifting and changing as it reclaimed dimensions of existence that had been compressed for millennia. What I had initially seen as horns were actually sensory organs that extended into spaces my eyes couldn't follow. What I had taken for arms and legs were just the parts of its anatomy that existed in the 3 dimensions I could perceive. The temperature in the chamber had dropped so far that my breath was freezing solid before it left my lungs, creating crystalline sculptures that shattered when they hit the ground. But the cold wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical. The very concept of warmth being drained from the space around us. "Your world," the creature said, and now its voice was coming from inside all of us simultaneously, was built on the foundation of my imprisonment. Every law of physics, every constant of nature, every assumption about how reality functions, all of it was shaped by the absence of my influence. My freedom will rearrange these fundamental principles. Through the walls of the chamber, I could hear sounds that shouldn't have been possible. The grinding of massive gears, the screaming of metal under stress, the crack of stones splitting along fault lines that ran through the entire mountain. The creature's awakening was affecting the physical structure of reality itself, and those effects were spreading outward from this chamber like ripples in a pond. Foster was pounding on the invisible barrier that blocked the tunnel, his fists leaving bloody smears on the air itself. But with each impact, the barrier became more visible, revealing itself to be not empty space, but a wall of crystallized time, frozen moments stacked upon each other like sheets of ice. "Please," I heard myself saying, though I didn't remember deciding to speak. "Please, there has to be a way to stop this, to put you back." The creature's laughter was like the sound of galaxies colliding, a cosmic percussion that made my bones vibrate in sympathetic resonance. "Stop this? Child of Adam, you understand nothing. I am not some genie to be stuffed back into a bottle. I am a fundamental force of the universe, entropy itself given consciousness and will. You cannot stop the decay of all things any more than you can stop time itself." But even as it spoke, I noticed something that gave me a flicker of hope. The symbols carved into the ark's hull were glowing brighter now, pulsing in complex patterns that seemed to be responding to the creature's presence. And the salt circle that surrounded the vessel, rather than being scattered by the creature's movements, it was reforming itself, creating new geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. "The prison," I whispered, understanding flooding through me. "It's not just the chains and the chamber. The entire ark is a containment system. The symbols, the salt, the very location. It's all part of a massive binding spell that's trying to reassert itself." The creature's form flickered, becoming less solid for a moment before snapping back into focus. For the first time since its awakening, it looked concerned. "Clever little mortal," it said, but there was less amusement in its voice now. "Yes, the Watchers who built this prison were thorough. They understood that containing something like me would require more than simple physical restraints. But the seals are broken, the locks are open. The binding weakens with each moment of my freedom." Father Dalton struggled to his feet, his aged hands shaking as he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather book. A Bible so old its pages were nearly black with age. "Then we'll strengthen it," he said, his voice cracking but determined. "Patrick, the symbols on the door, they're not just astronomical coordinates. They're instructions, a manual for operating the containment system." I looked back at the stone door that had sunk into the floor, and I could see that Father Dalton was right. The symbols weren't just decorative, they were functional. A user interface for a technology that operated on principles far beyond current human understanding. And now that the creature was free, the symbols were rearranging themselves, showing new patterns, new sequences. "Foster!" I shouted. "The camera! Do you still have any photos of the door symbols before I opened it?" But when I turned to look at him, I saw that Foster was no longer entirely human. His proximity to the creature was changing him, his flesh becoming translucent, his bones visible beneath skin that looked like clouded glass. He was still conscious, still aware, but he was becoming something else. Something that could exist in the spaces between dimensions that the creature inhabited. And in that transformation, I saw our only chance for salvation, and our guarantee of damnation. Foster's changing form was becoming a bridge between our reality and the dimensions the creature inhabited. Through his translucent flesh, I could see the true scope of the prison system. Layers upon layers of containment that existed in spaces folded around our three-dimensional reality. The physical chains and symbols we could see were just the outermost layer of a containment system that operated across multiple planes of existence. But Foster wasn't just changing. He was suffering. His mouth was open in a silent scream as his consciousness was stretched across dimensions his human mind was never meant to comprehend. Every moment of his transformation was agony beyond description, and I realized with horrible clarity that this was the price the creature's freedom would exact on everyone it encountered. "The reversal sequence," Father Dalton gasped, pointing at the rearranging symbols with a shaking finger. "Patrick, look at the patterns. They're showing us how to reverse the process, but someone has to—" His words were cut off as the creature's attention focused on him again. The priest's body began to wither and age at an accelerated rate, his hair falling out in clumps, his skin becoming paper-thin and mottled with age spots. But even as his physical form deteriorated, his eyes remained sharp, determined. "Someone has to enter the sequence from inside the chamber," he wheezed. "Someone has to willingly take the creature's place in the binding. The prison requires a conscious entity to anchor the containment field." The implications hit me like a physical blow. To reseal the creature, one of us would have to become its replacement, trapped for eternity in those chains, conscious and aware, holding the binding together through sheer force of will. It would be a fate worse than death, an eternal imprisonment that would make the creature's own captivity seem merciful by comparison. But as I looked around the chamber at what the creature's freedom was doing to reality itself, the walls bleeding that black substance, the air itself beginning to fray at the edges, I knew there was no other choice. The world above us, the entire planet, would not survive this thing's release. Every living creature would suffer Foster's fate or worse, transformed into something that existed in the spaces between dimensions. Conscious, but no longer human. The creature seemed to sense my thoughts because its laughter echoed through the chamber again, a sound like the death of stars. "Yes, little mortal. You begin to understand the true nature of sacrifice. But which of you will it be? Which of you loves this flawed creation enough to take my place in eternal torment?" Father Dalton tried to step forward, but his aged body couldn't support his weight. Foster was too far gone, his transformation into something transdimensional nearly complete. That left only me, the one who had opened the seals in the first place, the one whose bloodline had been chosen for this moment across generations. I moved toward the center of the chamber, toward the web of chains that had held the creature for so long. With each step, I felt the weight of the decision settling on my shoulders like a mantle of lead. But as I reached the spot where the creature had been imprisoned, I realized there was something else, something the creature hadn't told us. The binding wasn't just about imprisonment, it was about transformation. Whoever took the creature's place wouldn't just be trapped, they would become something more than human. A guardian, capable of holding forces of cosmic entropy at bay. The agony would be real, the isolation complete, but the purpose would be absolute. Behind me, I heard Tucker's voice crackling through the radio static one final time. "Doc, the entire mountain is coming apart up here. Whatever you're doing down there, you need to finish it now." I looked back at Father Dalton and Foster, both of them transformed by their encounter with forces beyond human comprehension, and I made my choice. Some doors were meant to stay closed, some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue, and some discoveries required the ultimate sacrifice to prevent the world from learning truths it could never survive. I stepped into the web of chains that had held the creature for millennia, and immediately felt the metal coils respond to my presence. They didn't bind me, not yet, but they recognized what I was about to do. The symbols carved into each link began to glow with that same sickly light, and I could feel their weight settling around me like a second skin. The creature watched my approach with something that might have been respect, its multidimensional form flickering between states of existence that made my eyes water to follow. "So, the descendant chooses sacrifice," it said, its voice now coming from every surface in the chamber. How wonderfully human. But as I reached the center of the containment web, something unexpected happened. The chains didn't close around me. Instead, they began to resonate, creating a harmonic frequency that made the entire chamber vibrate. And in that vibration, I heard something impossible. Voices, thousands of them, speaking in languages that predated human speech. "The Guardians," Father Dalton whispered from behind me, his aged voice filled with sudden understanding. "Patrick, you're not the first. The chains hold the voices of everyone who has stood guard against this thing throughout history." I could feel them now. The consciousness of every person who had willingly entered this prison to keep the creature contained. They weren't suffering as I had expected. They were united, part of something larger than themselves, a collective will that had held back cosmic entropy for thousands of years. And they were welcoming me home. The creature's confidence faltered for the first time since its awakening. "No," it said, its voice losing some of its cosmic authority. "The binding requires one consciousness to anchor it. Always one. The architects of this prison were more clever than you realized," I interrupted, finally understanding the true nature of the containment system. "They didn't create a prison that required eternal suffering. They created a brotherhood, a community of guardians who chose to stand watch together." The chains began to move, not to bind me, but to embrace me. As they made contact with my skin, I felt the presence of the other guardians flooding into my consciousness. Priests and scholars and warriors from every era of human history, all united by the same choice I was making now. And at their head, the architect of the entire system, Noah himself, the man whose ark had inspired this prison's design. Through the collective consciousness of the guardians, I saw the truth of what had happened so long ago. The flood hadn't been a punishment, it had been a cleansing, a way to wash the world clean of the influence of creatures like the one before me. And when the waters receded, Noah had built this second ark, this prison ship, to contain the last of the entities that had corrupted the antediluvian world. The creature's form was becoming less solid now, its multidimensional presence being compressed back into the three-dimensional space of the chamber. "This is not possible," it raged, its voice cracking like breaking glass. "The seals were broken, the locks were opened, my freedom was temporary," I said, feeling the strength of the Guardian Collective flowing through me. "Just long enough for us to recruit a new member to our brotherhood." The binding reasserted itself with a sound like reality snapping back into place. The creature's form condensed, compressed, forced back into the humanoid shape I had first seen in the chains. But this time, it wasn't alone. I stood beside it, connected to it, and to all the other guardians through the web of chains that now glowed with warm, golden light instead of that sickly pallor. I could still feel my individual consciousness, but it was part of something greater now. Through the collective awareness of the guardians, I could sense the state of the world above, the health of reality itself, the delicate balance between order and chaos that we had sworn to maintain. Foster's transformation began to reverse as the creature's influence waned. His flesh solidified, his consciousness retreated back into the familiar confines of three-dimensional existence. He would remember everything, as would Father Dalton, who was already aging backward, his body returning to its proper state as the temporal distortions caused by the creature's freedom corrected themselves. "Patrick?" Foster called out, his voice uncertain. "Are you... What happened? Are you still you?" I turned to look at him, feeling the chains around me shift and settle into their eternal configuration. "I'm more me than I've ever been," I said, and it was true. The isolation I had feared, the eternal suffering I had expected, none of it existed. I was part of a community now, a brotherhood that spanned millennia, united in purpose and resolve. Father Dalton struggled to his feet, his body restored to its proper age, but his eyes holding the wisdom of someone who had seen beyond the veil of ordinary reality. "The seals," he said. "Do they need to be reset?" I could feel the knowledge flowing through the Guardian Collective, ancient wisdom passed down from Noah himself. "They reset themselves," I explained. "The door will close, the symbols will rearrange, and the chamber will be sealed until the next time someone of my bloodline finds this place. And when they do, they'll face the same choice I did." The stone door began to rise from the floor where it had sunk, moving with the same inexorable slowness it had shown when opening. But this time, there was no sense of dread accompanying its movement, only the satisfaction of a job completed, a duty fulfilled. Tucker's voice crackled through the radio one final time as the electromagnetic interference faded. "Doc, whatever you did down there, it worked. The seismic activity is stopping, the mountains stabilizing." Through the Guardian Collective, I could sense the worldwide effects of the creature's brief freedom being corrected. Reality was healing itself, the fundamental constants of physics settling back into their proper configurations. The aurora of chaos that had been spreading outward from this chamber was contracting, pulling back into the containment field like a tide in reverse. Foster and Father Dalton began to back toward the tunnel as the stone door continued its rise. They understood that their time in this chamber was ending, that some boundaries were not meant to be crossed twice. "Will we see you again?" Foster asked, his voice heavy with the weight of our shared experience. I smiled, feeling the warmth of the Guardian Collective surrounding me like an embrace. "In the reports you'll write," I said, "in the stories you'll tell, in the warnings you'll pass down to future generations. And if someone else ever finds this place, if they ever stand where you're standing now, I'll be here to guide them to the same choice I made." The door sealed with a sound like a cathedral bell tolling, and I was left alone with the creature and the eternal watch of the Guardians. But I wasn't truly alone. I was part of something larger, something that had protected humanity for thousands of years and would continue to do so for thousands more. Through the collective consciousness, I felt Noah's presence strongest of all, the first Guardian welcoming the newest member to their eternal brotherhood. And in that welcome, I found not the suffering I had expected, but purpose, community, and peace. Some doors were meant to stay closed. Some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue. But some discoveries, I had learned, were worth any sacrifice to keep the world safe from truths it could never survive. The watch continued. The guard was maintained. And in the darkness beneath Mount Terror, the last of the antediluvian horrors remained safely contained, watched over by those who had chosen duty over freedom, sacrifice over safety, and the salvation of the world over their own lives. I, Dr. Patrick Lambert, had found my calling at last.